I'd like to start this week's lecture talking about a true pioneer in the world of system administration. And she came from a world initially that wasn't programming, because in the 60s and 70s, there was no notion of, system software engineer or actual programmer. They drew most or all of their talent from the world of statistics and mathematician. Now, this lady I'm talking about her name is Evi Nemeth. And as I said, she pioneered system administration, and she practically wrote the handbook on it. She was, in fact, and actually, while I'm talking, I should have had the handbook with me. Let me go get it really quickly. 1 second. And here is the handbook. It is the Unix and Linux System Administration Handbook, the 5th edition. And I do encourage everyone to read this, as well as the Linux Bible, as well as anything that you can get your hands on for Windows Server as well. And the lady, she actually wrote the 1st and 2nd edition and 3rd editions. So she really wrote I guess you could say laid the foundation, as they say, to the notions of what a system administration or administrator actually does. And she was much more than technical, than just technical as well. She actually had a lot of life and wisdom sayings, as they say. And so she sailed around the world. She was a wine connoisseur. She loved sushi. And that's before, all those things were popular. And so she was a true pioneer in all aspects, of life. Some of the things that she would say is she espoused the idea of LBD, or learn by doing. The fact of the matter is, you don't really understand something until you implement it. That's why I'm forcing everyone to do Linux installations and the Debian installations from the ground up. I even would rather you utilize Debian more so than Kali, and even though they're both distributions of Linux and they're both related to each other, Kali comes with so much software, you lose the idea that you have to install whatever you want to use, and that's why I'm using Debian as opposed to Kali this semester. Because Debian is so much more hands-on. It doesn't come with a lot of things, so you're tasked with installing these things, and that's where the learning happens. And she also, I'm reading the list here, you don't understand, as I said, you don't understand something unless you do it, unless you implement it, unless you maintain it and troubleshoot it. And I'm going to say the adjoining or the adjacent knowledge is the fact that you have to fail. You have to fail, FAIL. You have to fail many times before you succeed. And the side effect of that is that when you do succeed, it's so sweet. So another side effect of trying and failing all these Debian installs is that yes, you will fail but it's more rewarding now when you succeed. And so the rewards for this are, in fact, many. And so let's take a look at this job posting. So some of you, as I said, would like to know what good is knowing Linux? Well, here is a permanent full-time position that was emailed to me and this is going back from a few years ago when I was actually looking for full-time work prior to me teaching so many classes, and I still get these job posts, in my feed, whether that's emailed to me or texted to me. And this one was actually emailed to me the other day. Robert Half Technology, as it says here, has a client looking to hire a full-time Linux systems administrator on a permanent full-time basis. This role is on-site in their Farmington Hills office. Now, at the time of this recording, I literally received this like maybe a week ago. video, and I'm just putting this together and integrating this into my PowerPoint right here. And this is so that this is a very recent. So here are the responsibilities that this states of this job being a Linux systems administrator. We have installing, configuring, and maintaining Linux servers, Red Hat, Ubuntu, CentOS. Now, as everyone knows, we've been using Debian, and of course, Ubuntu is kind of like a bleeding edge version of Debian. So you're essentially dealing with many of the same archives, or many of the same repositories of programs, very similar to Debian. And then, of course, we've also brought up Red Hat and CentOS. Now, one of the differences between Red Hat and Debian is Red Hat, when it comes to installing programs, instead of saying apt install the whatever program you want to use, Red Hat uses RPMs or DNF. Okay, so just to be clear, and so for example, just a very quick example, and I have a picture. I took some notes here earlier, and for example, as I said, to install an update, to update your system from the command line on Debian, we recall it's sudo apt install update. In Red Hat, for example, if you had Fedora or Red Hat, it might be sudo DNF update. So instead of apt, advanced packaging tool, you would use DNF. So the process is very similar, except you're using a slightly different program. And as we all know, because Debian and Red Hat and CentOS and Ubuntu are all essentially using the Linux kernel, the file directory is very similar. The commands are very similar. There's just little nuances that are different, but that's the beauty of learning Linux. One thing that everyone has to understand, Linux by itself, when you tell people you run Linux or you understand Linux from a system admin standpoint, you're telling people that you essentially understand any operating system that has or utilizes the Linux kernel. So let me just give you everyone an example right here. All Linux is, if we could containerize what Linux actually is, there's the most vital part, which is the kernel. I'll just say K for kernel, and everything else is just apps that are loaded with the kernel. So for example, we have Kali. Kali is a huge, very well-known version of Linux, and it's brought to us by a company called Offensive Security. So Kali is going to come out with a lot of productivity. It's going to come pre-installed with a lot of productivity tools on it. It's going to come installed with a lot of programming tools, and then of course all the exploitation tools, of course, on it. Now the difference, but you're still dealing with the Linux kernel right here. Now Debian is a little different. Debian will have the Linux kernel and it will have the productivity suites. It's just not going to have Python and Java pre-installed, and it's definitely not going to have any of the exploitations installed, but it's still the same kernel. It's the same thing with Red Hat and CentOS. You're still dealing with the Linux kernel. It's just all the only difference is all the other programs that are going to be installed. Now, managing databases right here, because we're still talking about this job posting right here. We're going to be managing databases right here, MySQL, Postgres, or Oracle. And managing databases is a little like learning Linux, because if you learn the core syntax of MySQL, then you'll also know Postgres and you'll also know Oracle. Okay? Administer and optimize network infrastructure, including VLANs, routing, and firewalls. We will actually be talking about that in 2 weeks, just so everyone knows. And configure and maintain checkpoint firewalls to ensure network security. we will be going over a program in the next coming weeks called IP chains. And IP chains represents rules to live by. So it will be rules that your server will adhere to protect the server from undue, unwanted connections and unwanted protocols. All right, and they are looking for junior to mid-level candidates in the $80,000 range. Okay, so if you're looking for a reason why we are learning Windows Server and Linux, it is because of this green stuff right here. And so if you want some ROI, return on your investment, for this school, for going to school, then knowing Windows Server and knowing Linux is a great way to get your money back, because especially if you know Unix, Linux, and Windows Server, you'll be very, very, very hireable. And here's an example. Full-time work and, knowing Linux right here, and you can see that they are looking to pay $80,000 right there. That to me makes this class very much worthwhile. All right, let's do another example right here. Here we have Indeed.com, the website. Here is find salaries, and we'll do Linux administrator right here. And anywhere in the United States, just for the heck of it, let's press search, and we can see average base salary $88,716. So I ask you, do you think learning Unix, Linux, and Windows Server can actually add to your bottom dollar? And the answer is, hopefully, the answer is yes. As was mentioned before, being a Linux administrator can yield some good results to your wallet, essentially. But it's one thing to say become a decent or good Linux administrator. It's another thing to say, okay, what does that mean? What are the daily tasks of a system administrator? Whether or not you're utilizing Linux, you're utilizing Windows, or you're utilizing FreeBSD, which is a free version of Unix. What are the things that we have to do? So whether or not you're dealing with Linux or Windows or whatever, the first thing that you'll have to do or know is controlling access. So that's one of the most important things. And I, of course, am getting this from the Unix and Linux Administration Handbook, 5th edition. And then, of course, that was in spirit written by Evie Nemeth, and of course contributing also Snyder, Hein, Whaley, and Dan Mackin. Okay, so this, of course, is in order in the book, and this is the very first thing. So believe it or not, that is the most important job, is controlling access. And you control access by creating users how you want to create them and placing these users into the appropriate groups. And as you can see, and then from knowing where things have to go, knowing what assets are available. Here are some here are some valuable assets. The groups are what group policy is what determines who can get to these resources and who is blocked, and everyone in between. So that's exactly what we have been working on. We have adding hardware. So that is kind of more like in the data center, because in the data center you're going to be adding cards and soups, supervisors and switches and routers and everything in between. In terms of clients, you're just dealing with PCs, Windows 11 with the global images on them. That can be pretty much automated, but you'll have to oversee the installation of hardware and software, and that's going to take some time. Automating tasks. So automating tasks such as automating the maintenance of your software packages, automating the update and upgrading of your packages, automating the clearing of your logs, for example, or the archiving of your logs to free up space in your production environment. Those are examples of automating tasks. Things like Ruby, Python, Java, and there's a special language that is developed on Unix and Linux systems, and it's called Awk, AWK, and it was really heavily being used in the 80s. It's still available now, and the Awk awk as a language, I know it seems kind of a funny name, awk, but the awk as a language, it's actually entirely an entire different language, an entire distinct language that is included for free on Linux and Unix distributions, and it's mainly for automation of your operating system. Like I said, archiving logs, automating the upgrading and updating of your system, things like that. Daily tasks, if you will. All right, overseeing backups, that's of course self-explanatory. Obviously, we've never done anything like that in this class. That would be something more useful if you actually had data worthwhile to even back up. Of course, we should probably run just a small demonstration before the semester ends. Installing and maintaining software. So we will be installing software starting next week. We will be installing Apache. We'll be installing IP chains. I'll just say IPC here. We'll be installing to go along with Apache. We can install PHP, and that could be another language that could help us automate tasks. And then we'll also install some SQL variant, and that could be Maria, or that could be any MySQL, whatever. This, of course, is what we call a LAMP, L-A-M-P, and I'll just put that in a different shade right here, LAMP. And LAMP stands for Linux, A stands for Apache, M stands for MySQL or MariaDB, whatever, and then the P stands for PHP. So a LAMP system is a very robust system that can create, a very, very robust application, and it is comprehensive. It creates a very comprehensive application. Okay, now some of the other things you'll be doing as a system admin is monitoring the entire system, of course, and you do that primarily through logs. Every application that you run, whether it's Apache, SQL, or Exim, let me use another color for Exim. Exim is an email server. So you can actually use an email client and actually use this free email server to actually send and receive emails. So everything that we install, will have its own log file, especially Apache, and you can monitor each of these applications through examining the log file. Speaking of examining log files, that has a lot to do with troubleshooting as well, and a large part of troubleshooting is finding out, for example, talking to a user and getting him to tell you what he was doing when the issue in front of him was actually going on, and chances are his logs will reveal something that happened, like an anomaly. For example, let's say a user has repeated complaints to you that suddenly out of nowhere his system slows down because of a lag system. So this would be germane to a Windows system, and let's say you look into the logs and then you see that somebody had just enabled the Symantec antivirus service in the background. We all know that antivirus, all it does is slow down a computer. They have done studies on this, and they have, for example, just for the experimenting purposes, playing a racing game just to check out the FPS, and that shows how the FPS shows how fast the game is, and then they ran Symantec in the background, and they saw the FPS drop dramatically, as much as 30%, which is a huge drop when you're dealing with overall speed. So that's an example of a company's policy actually serving to enable packet loss, or FPS loss, because of their own policy. And so that's what we call unintended consequences. So a lot of times enterprise or some people that rely on speed will make sure that part of their protocols is immune to antivirus activity. Let's see, we have maintaining local documentation. Many companies, many enterprises will have what they call the BOK, which is Book of Knowledge, as BOK. I know Stellantis has their Book of Knowledge, and the problem with local documentation is you can have so so much of it. However, you can have so much documentation, but you can't, it's really not really organized. So if you have this big glom of documentation that's unorganized, it's essentially useless. So in order for like something like the Book of Knowledge to be useful, it has to be, I'm going to say relevant, and it has to be updated, or I'll just say updated, and it has to be organized, okay, and it should be it should be modulated. What I mean by modulated is that it should be separate from other documents, so it can't rely on other documents. And this way, if you've been working on a problem, let's say a problem with a network, and you're able to solve it, you can update the Book of Knowledge, but you're not updating the entire thing. All you have to do is worry about updating that particular part, okay, and you won't disrupt any other part of the documentation. Moving on, we have another, key core duties of a system admin is monitoring security. Now, some of you are like, well, wait a second, isn't that similar or the same as controlling access? And I understand it, you take a look, I understand what you're saying. You take a look at a company, and there is the inside of the company, all right? And that's the inside, could be right here. And then there's the outside of the company here. So when it comes to user controlling access has to do with users on the inside of the company. So you have a user right here, and the user will be part of a group. I'll just say G right here for group. Now, the idea of user management or controlling access for the user is that you, as I said, you have resources, whether they're inside of the company or outside of the company, and I'm just drawing it so that's outside of the company because I'm just running out of room, and you can control whether or not the group has access or not has access. And even if they do have access, you get to control whether or not they read, they write, they can write, or they can execute programs or files within this system resource. So that is what we call controlling access, and it is the very first essential duty of a system admin. But when it comes to monitoring security generally means on the outside, can you prevent certain people or certain entities, or whether or not they're I'm going to say, whether they're some sort of a criminal syndicate, whether or not they're even in an unintended disruptor, you are blocking them from getting into your network. So this is where the semantic comes into play, but I know I just gave you an example of where semantic is not the greatest because it uses so much processing power. That's for Windows. But for Linux, we use a program, and I just mentioned it in the last slide, called IP-Chain. So IP-Chain essentially is a Norton antivirus, except it's the free version of this, and it gets more to the point. IP-Chain is just pretty much a rule set that will allow or disallow based off of layer 3 protocols that will allow or disallow a site to be gotten to. And in another use case of any firewall program, an IP-Chain essentially is a firewall. Another use case is, hey, you can have somebody log into Facebook from inside your company, because remember, these aren't like, production line workers. If you have a professional enterprise company, you're going to get, people you're going to be supporting people with very, intellectually effort-driven jobs. So they're going to be professional. They're going to want to visit their Facebook profile, but there are certain things that you can prevent them from doing. For example, there's access control lists, or there's firewalls that allow the user to log into their Facebook, but they won't allow them to instant message anybody. And there are also rules and regulations or access control lists that don't allow ads to be shown on Facebook. Now, it's always nice to know that we can go to Facebook without ads, but the reason why you wouldn't want that in an enterprise environment, you wouldn't want to see those ads, is because it's number one, takes up too much bandwidth, and number two, if the user clicks on the wrong link, they can unwittingly click on an exploitation. they can download download an improper image, and the image might have some embedded code inside of it. So you're jeopardizing your whole entire local area network. We have tuning performance, developing site policies, obviously working with vendors, and then of course one of the biggest things that you're going to be doing on a day-to-day basis is firefighting. That could be something like one of your clients can't fire up his laptop, maybe he spilled coffee on his keyboard, or a lot of it is printer stuff. You're gonna have to be troubleshooting the local printer. So that is a representative of the kind of fun that you're going to be having. So as we said, one of the various, very primary core duties of a system admin is controlling access. So that starts with user creation. Now, as I mentioned before, we can take a look at our existing users, and at this point in time when I did this command, we only had 2 users, Jason and Test. And we also know that we have to use the absolute path. Now we know it's the absolute path because the portion the portion of the command in which we have to input where we are actually listing is utilizing the front slash and then the directory, or the name of the directory, and that's home, and that is what we call the absolute path, okay? And we have to use the front slash before the directory name. That, of course, yields the 2 users, Jason and Test, and these are what we call daily users. Okay, I'll just say DAILY, and that's different than a system user, in which it may or may not have a home directory. Thus, it's not listed. It's not listed because it's not listed in this home directory because the system user wouldn't have the home directory. Now, taking a look at this, we have just the ls command, and that will list all of the contents within the home directory of my username Jason right here. Now, we can also use the -d switch, in which it will only list out the who the directory belongs to. So home/home Jason belongs to Jason, and the group is Jason. Whereas if I'm at my command, my prompt in my terminal, I can actually utilize ls-ld on another home directory. Here we have test. And that, of course, because we're using the D switch, that will show you that the test home directory is owned by test and is within the group number test, or the group test. Now, the ID command shows information about the currently logged in user or another user. So this is the home user. So you just literally press ID, and the unspoken default value will be whatever user is currently logged in. And that gives you information about the currently logged in user. For example, my user ID is 1000, and that's the user. That's the version of the ID that the computer uses to facilitate what you're trying to do. Now, the group that I belong to is also named Jason, and that is also considered to be 1000 according to the computer. Now, in order for it to understand that 1000 refers to the name Jason, it does a further query to link the user ID to the human readable name, but the human readable name means nothing. It's just going by the user ID. Okay, and then here are the groups that I'm associated with. 1000, of course, my username, CD-ROM, floppy, sudo, because Jason is in the sudo group and whatnot. But you recall that it's part of setting up Debian is that you actually yourself had to be transferred or copied to the sudoers user group, and you can see that we never did that with test, so test cannot do sudo commands, and we know that because if we run id test, we can see that it is not part of the sudoers group. Okay, as you know, we are reviewing from a couple weeks ago. I know after this winter break, you may be a little bit, maybe kind of foggy, if you will, and just trying to center you, get you back on, back on a roll, if you will. So again, we can look at the PS command or program, which shows the local processes. The local shell processes only, because that's the default version. Now, if you add the -a switch, this shows all processes within the terminal right here. And then the -au switch right here, of course, shows all processes at all, no matter what shell is running, that are associated with the user. So these could be, things that we didn't even realize that we were a part of, but just by our existence, we are part of. So things like libexec, libxorg, this allows us to, the xorg, it allows us to actually maintain a graphical windowed environment. This allows us to have the bash shell at our disposal. And then, of course, this represents the actual command that we ran. So another example of this is, I want you to run this command too, if you have a chance. It's called top. And those of you that have a MacBook, you can even run top as part of your MacBook Pro terminal, because your MacBook Pro terminal is based off of Unix, and as you know, Unix and Linux are cousins. Their kernels actually are cousins. So anyways, the command top is actually a kind of very similar to PS-AU. It'll show all of the processes. So go ahead and run that on, and you can even run it in Linux too. So you can try top so you can see all of the processes. All right, again, this is review in the etc password file. We can see all of the user, even the system users. We have all this information about them. We have the fact this is the human, and let me get my trusty marker out. You ever notice lately I've been using the marker a lot? I feel as if it makes the PowerPoint more engaging, I guess. It's kind of like I'm animating the PowerPoint. Go figure. I guess I'm probably, you guys probably think I'm crazy. But anyways, so this is the human readable name. This refers to the fact that the password of the user JSON is considered just marked with an X, because we all know from the last couple weeks ago that the actual password is sent in an encrypted format in the etc, I'll just say shadow, in the etc shadow file right here. Let me write that shadow file. That's where the user passwords are in. And anyways, this refers to the UID. This refers to the ID, the group ID. This is the full name of the user, and this refers to the fact that there could have been more detail shown, like the proxy name and all that. You recall when you entered in all that information. This is the default home directory, and this is the shell environment. The user, the main user, the main daily user, me, is granted the bash shell, okay, and the regular daily user, like, meaning in my case, going back to the user right there, test, he would be given just the regular shell without all the niceties that that you and I are granted, like this colorized text, which is always nice, and the fact that it always shows the username and the prompt and the host name that is by default Debian. Okay, this of course shows the etc Etsy group shows detailed information about all of the groups here, including ourselves right here. And and as I said, Etsy group contains information about one particular group. Each group entry is divvied up into 4 colon separated fields right here. And so this shows every group that I am a part of. So CD-ROM, floppy, sudo, and so on and so forth. And of course, just as a review, this shows the group name for the group. This shows the fact that this is the obsolete password field. This is the group ID for the field. So this is the human readable form. Okay. Oh, just so you know, this is not from me per se. This is from the Red Hat Engineering Guide or Red Hat Administrative Guide or Administration Guide, and I do recommend that to everyone, and I could upload that to this week so you can peruse that at your leisure. And just so you know, when you read it, you're going to see a lot of familiar syntax and a lot of familiar explanation, and that's because Red Hat is going to be very equivalent, and I'll just use the logical equivalency to Debian. Okay, those of you that have taken discrete mathematics have recognized this. That's logically equivalent to Debian. Now, as I said, you have 2 different flavors of Linux right here, but they have one thing in common. We can abstract the fact that they have the kernel, Linux kernel in them both. The only real difference is the Red Hat and Debian come shipped with just different applications. And of course, they're supported by 2 completely different mindsets, 2 completely different groups. Okay, and then finally, a list of users who are members of the group as a supplementary group, user 1, user 2, and user 3. Okay, before I move on to this PowerPoint slide, let me point you toward this book right here, Red Hat Training and Certifications Student Workbook. And hold on just a second. I see that I got a message right here. But anyways, it is the Red Hat Training and Certification book. And this is the book that I received from the company EDX. So Red Hat Enterprise Linux Edition 1. And it goes through a lot of the same things that we were talking about. So here is getting started, accessing the command line, managing files from the command line, creating and viewing and editing text files, managing local Linux users and groups, controlling access to files with permissions. So I want you to read through this as well, who is Red Hat, and I want you to understand that Red Hat, once you know Debian, you also kind of are familiar with Red Hat because it uses the command line like we have been doing. It's got these little quizzes in here. Here's cat, the cat command. Here is the cat command again. Here is the head. Here is WC, the password command. Here's ls etc password and things like that. So these should all be familiar to you. And of course, there's going to be little differences. So anyways, one of the differences between Red Hat and Debian is the fact that with user add, if you simply utilize the user add command in Red Hat, it will create the home directory. And actually the -m switch for user add actually moves the home directory in Red Hat, and Debian, of course. And then let me put I went to try to put a mark there. I couldn't do it. Anyways, let me try again. The -m command right here, the -m switch, I should say, for Debian, actually expressly creates the directory. And here with user add, we have -u that's another switch we haven't talked about that unlocks the user account. So you can lock it, and then the -U unlocks it. Creating groups from the command line, we have group add. So here we're adding interns to our groups. Now, what I did here was I tried adding it without sudo, and then of course it doesn't even register that the command is even there. Now, when you type sudo group add interns, okay, it will actually, once you add your password, because of course group add is a program that requires sudo as a prefix because it requires root privileges. So you put in your sudo password, and then we can see that if we utilize the tail command as opposed to the cat command, if we utilize the tail command and express that we utilize the end switch and then the number 2, that specifies that we want only the last 2 line items to show, we can see that interns actually has been added, and we can see that the GUID, or the group ID, is 1002. Now you can see that we have a sys user right here, and we know it's a system user. Well, the name is obvious that's a sys user, but what really gives it away that's a sys user is the fact that it's the group ID is 998. So anything below 1,000 is a system group, and anything above 1,000 is a daily user group. Here's some group add options. Here we can add the -G option specifies a particular GID or group ID for it. So we have group add, okay, and we have the name that we want to add, group 1. But here we can actually use the -G switch to specify the fact that it wants to be given the group ID of 10,000. All right, so here we have, again, tail N2 Etsy group only lists the last 2 items. All right, let's take a look at the output right here. We're using the tail command to only list the last 2 line items, like I just said in that other mini video. But we can see that the name that we created was interns. Now, what would happen if you could imagine we started off with this small little entity, and there are managers, there's admins, and there's interns. But what would happen if we grow out of this singular entity and we wind up with another entity? Maybe we buy into another existing company, or they buy into us, or whatever, and we wind up having to expand our intern groups. One is like intern east, and the other one is interns west. What would happen, in this case, these are the original interns. What would happen if we wanted to change the name of interns to something else? And this is where we can utilize the group mod command. And the group mod modifies, of course, as the name suggests, modifies the properties of an existing group. The -N option, of course, specifies a new name for the group. So here's an example. Here's what I call the autocomplete blues, because here I did remember to use sudo group mod -N, which refers to the fact that we're changing the name of interns into interns C division. So in other words, we've grown from one entity to another. So maybe this could be the original interns was the C division, and we've moved to the, let's say, D division. So we want to specify interns C division, interns D division, which is what we're doing. So this is the name that we want to change it to, interns C division, and the last parameter refers to the actual original name of the group, so the Linux system knows what group to change. And here's what we call the autocomplete blues, because I said tail, and then I said Etsy group, GRO, and it wound up matching graph group and then another version of group with a dash. So I decided to just say, okay, tail, Etsy group, and here are some of the output. So in order to basically isolate the output to make sure that I only get, output what I want, I just did, instead of saying tail, and this is the default of the tail, which is like, it shows the last 14, or it shows 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So this is the default. So if we want to adjust the default look, the -N2 shows the last two line items, and of course a group that I created, the knit checker group, and also interns C division right there. Finally, changing group membership, we can utilize here we have user add m-m user client. It will create a user client and the home directory for user client, and by default it will also put user client 1 in its own group as well. And in order to complete the user add, I guess you could say, function, we also have to create a password for it, and the passwd command with user client 1 as its parameter allows us to create a password for user client 1. And then of course we put the initial password here, and we retype the new password here, and then as a sign of the fact we did everything correctly, it says password updated successfully. And here we can use the tail command to give us, and the -N3 means that wants us to give us, we wanted to give the last 3 lines in Etsy password, and then this is the output right here. This shows user client 1, and we can see its user ID is 1002, group ID is 1003. Now the reason why it jumped 1 is because I believe there was another group that was created independent of any username, so that's why there is a jump. And we can see ID user client 1. This shows all the groups that are associated with it. User client 1 here, and then user client 1. So this just says that the primary groups of user client 1 is in fact user client 1. Now we can modify the group membership of user client 1, and we have to know that the membership of the group is controlled with user management. So that's why user mod is the command to change the user's groups, and the full command is actually user mod using the -G switch. Okay, the user mod -A command adds a user to the supplementary group. So for example, sudo user mod -AG knit checker group user client 1. So this will add user client 1 to the pre-existing group, the knit checker group. So if we do the ID of user client 1, we wind up with the fact that the UID of user client 1 is 1002. The group ID, the primary group, is group ID 1003, and the name of the group is user client 1. It's also in group 997 called the knit checker group. Okay, the chmod command or change mode command allows us to change the permissions on a file. And that's what, if we go back all the way back to the essential duties of an administrator, it's controlling access, as you may have recalled. So one way we can control access is file permissions. Only the owner and the super user can change the permissions of a file. So when you go ahead, and let me just insert a text box right here. When you go ahead and create a user, like say user add -m Doug Smith right here, and you press enter, you created Doug Smith as a user. So what Doug Smith actually is whatever file Doug Smith creates or directory, he owns the file or directory, as well as the super user. Now, when we do the ls-l output, we can see that all the permissions are divvied up by something called UGO, also known as, like, affectionately known as UGO. And the first group is the rights of the user. When I say rights, there's the three main rights, and that's read, write, and execute. Okay, and the group also potentially has these rights, and other also potentially has these rights. The user is the singular person, and the group is a collection of people of which the user can be part of. So it all depends. So the user of the file that is created by the owner, if the owner is a part of a certain group, that group can either read, write, or execute, and everyone outside of that group is considered other, and they can also have the rights of read, write, or execute. Now, just because they're available doesn't mean they exist, so you may want anyone, a member of a certain group, to only read it. So they would have rights to read it, but not to write or execute. So that is the symbol for that. Same thing with other. Anyone else might be able to read it, but you wouldn't want them to write in it or execute it. A lot of times, if you have really sensitive information, like let's say we had an engineering drawing, so I'll just say ENG, or let's just make it really simple. We'll just call it IP. Maybe there's some intellectual property created by the user. Let me get a different marker right here. So we have intellectual property created by the user, and he is part of a group. So that means in this setup, the intellectual property can be read by anybody in the group that is designated, that the user says. So if the user is part of this group, or if the user created another group, and thus the owner owns that group, that means that if the file is, the file can be read by that group. Now, a lot of times you will see that anybody else actually will not be able to even read it. So thus, you would have this dash here to symbolize the fact that anybody outside this group can't even read it, they can't write it, and they can't execute it. Here's an example of the output of ls-l. So we have contact list, which is inside the directory intern resources. And then here's the command ls-l. And we can see that the first group refers to the user, the second group refers to the group, and the third group refers to other. When I say group, I meant I'm going to say batch of permissions. So this is batch 1, this is batch 2, and this is batch 3. The first batch refers to the user, the second batch refers to the group, and the third batch refers to the other, and they can either read, write, execute, and read, write, execute here. So if you adapt with these permissions here in a very sensitive document, you have the user obviously can read, write, and execute because he created the document. Now the group that the user belongs to, they will usually just say everyone can read it, but nobody can write it and nobody can execute it. And then everyone else, anyone outside of the user's group, nobody can do anything. Okay, and this octally, this would be 7, this would be 4, and then this would be nil. This would be 0. So this is the way it usually works. It's usually an octal. So if nobody can do anything, it's a 0. If you have a situation in which only there's only execute access, that's a 1. Okay, if there's only read access, that's a 2. If there is execute and read access, that's a 3. And if there's read only access, that's a 4. And you can see if there's read, write, execute, that's a 7. So that corresponded to this 7, and that's 4, and that's 0. And here's another example of permission encoding. So that's execute only, that's write only. See how these, when the number is 1, that means that the bit for read, write, or execute is on, but it corresponds to the particular position of the bit. So that's 0, 1, 0. That means it's right. But yet if there's a 1, 0, 0, even though there's the same amount of 1s and 0s between these two, sequentially they are different. So that's a 1, so that means that's a read, because you have to match the permissions with the position. So here's 5, that's a 1, 0, 1, and so that's read and then write, and so on and so forth. Here's an example of a scoring system. So this refers, here we can match the binary equivalent. So that's 1, 2, 4. So when only the first position is active or up or on, that means it's a 1. Here we have the number 2, and it corresponds to that. Here's the number 3, because 1 and 2 are on, and this position is off. That's 1, 2, 4 in binary. So when 1 is up and this one is on, that means it's a 3. So read-write privileges is 4, write privileges is 2, execution privileges is 1. So if they were all on, that would be 7, which is why when we have RWX, that's a 7. Group read, write, execute, that's a 4, and other is 0. Now, if we want to change ownership in the group, we use the change group command. So we have contact list. If we want to change the group that the contact list is part of, we could say change group test. That, of course, isn't permitted because I didn't use sudo. So once I use sudo, the contact list is now owned by the group test. Okay, so now we can ls-l list the long version of contact list, and now we can see that it's gone back to JSON because I used the change group and I changed it back to JSON. See, I hear sudo change group JSON contact list, and that is different from change group test contact list. So here I did sudo change group test contact list, and then when I did ls-l contact list, it did show that JSON was the owner, but it's now part of group test. So I had to once again do change group JSON to turn it back to the file contact list being once again owned by JSON.